During the trial, and in its aftermath, a virtual cottage industry evolved of expert analysts who attempted to explain the trial and critique the prosecution. Virtually all of the major criticisms were regurgitated recently in Vincent Bugliosi's book entitled Outrage. As the title implies, like other works, it is full of vitriol and accusations and is lacking a dispassionate, thoughtful discussion of the case. Criticism of the prosecution includes the argument that we relied too much on evidence that O.J. Simpson had abused his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, in order to establish a motive for murder. Bugliosi takes the opposite view. The prosecution should have presented even more domestic violence evidence. Some have argued that the prosecution erred by calling Detective Mark Furman and not sufficiently distancing itself from him. Again, Bugliosi disagrees, arguing that the prosecution should have embraced Furman and should have stood behind him. By comprehensively revealing the behind-the-scenes strategy and tactics of the prosecution, I will show that in virtually every major tactical decision, the prosecution chose the best available option. In each instance, I will provide enough information regarding the key decisions to allow readers to form their own opinions on such issues. But more important, readers will see how such decisions fit within the overall case strategy and made sense in the context of the trial as a whole. The failure to do this is the principal weakness of the outside analyses from commentators such as Vincent Bugliosi. For example, Bugliosi confesses that he did not watch the entire trial because he found it boring. While writing his book, Bugliosi called me several times to ask specific questions about what happened during the trial. When I asked him why he did not consult the trial transcript, he replied that it was too expensive to obtain a copy. He admitted that he did not read most of the transcript. He just reviewed specific portions such as the closing arguments. Even though I participated in the trial, it was necessary for me to reread the transcript in order to write this book. Failure to do so would undoubtedly have resulted in significant distortions, misrecollections, and failures of analysis. There are a number of examples of such mistakes in Vince's book. For instance, he accuses DNA prosecutor Woody Clark of failing to elicit the laboratory that the DNA testing for the prosecution had failed certain proficiency tests years earlier. Not so. Woody Clark addressed this issue in detail during his direct examination. Had Vince reviewed the trial transcript, he would have avoided making this and other unfounded criticisms. Similarly, Vince argues that the prosecution should have introduced O.J. Simpson's statement to the police in which he proclaimed his innocence. On its face, this is an astounding recommendation. The jury would have been allowed to hear the defendant's self-serving denial during the tape-recorded police interview, and the prosecution would have been unable to cross-examine Simpson. Vince's position is even more astounding when considered in the context of all of the evidence the prosecution presented against Simpson. Why does Vince argue that the prosecution should have used Simpson's statement? Because in the statement Simpson admitted to bleeding in his Bronco and at his estate on the night of the murders, an incriminating admission. Vince, unlike millions of Americans, did not watch much of the trial. Because he also failed to thoroughly review the trial transcript, he apparently was ignorant of the fact that the defense was not contesting that Simpson bled in the Bronco and at his home the night of the murders. Why would we introduce a self-serving statement? Simply to prove something that was not in dispute? An expert commentator who comprehensively reviewed the evidence and relative positions of both the defense and prosecution would not have made such an egregious mistake. Finally, many of the commentators, including Bugliosi, fail to consider the socio-political forces that were at work in the Simpson case. In this book we will see that the jury in this case was predisposed to accept the idea that Simpson was an African-American victim of the white establishment. Vince's failure to place the case into its overall social framework results in serious faults in his analysis. For example, Vince actually makes an argument so astounding that I must quote it. He suggests that the prosecution should have called former football player Jim Brown to testify that there was no evidence of O.J. in the black community. Further, according to Vince, Brown could have established that O.J. is the modern representation of the house Negro, who dressed well and lived much better than the plantation workers. Forget, for a moment, that such an irrelevant, outrageous, and offensive attack would have been inadmissible. Vince's strategy would have played right into the hands of those willing to believe the prosecution and police were out to get a successful African American who had made it as a celebrity in white society. It is impossible to conceive of anything that would have alienated this jury, or any jury, faster than Vince's proposed strategy. In a case that presents conclusive physical evidence proving guilt, you don't distract, anger, and alienate the jury by calling the defendant a house Negro. Yet buried within his diatribe against the prosecution, Bugliosi concedes that the not guilty verdict is traceable to dynamics other than the merits of the case presented against Simpson. Quoting himself in an earlier interview, Vince says that external social factors that influenced the verdict could be things like race, celebrity, and bogus allegations of police misconduct. Yet nowhere does he actually analyze the effects of such social and political forces on the verdict. These are only a few of the many examples of errors of fact and analysis that Vince makes in Outrage. No book can entirely document a trial that took over 9 months to present. Nor can one thoroughly present all aspects of a trial that produced over 40,000 pages of transcript and was reported on in thousands of hours of television coverage and milks the author to read lions of pages of print media accounts. However, my book presents in-depth coverage, from inside the prosecution, of the (6.ve) key aspects of the case: the domestic violence evidence, Mark Furman, the scientific and physical evidence, defense expert Henry Lee, and the closing arguments. I was involved in all of these aspects. The prosecution response is not intended to be merely an overview of the Simpson trial. Rather, it explains the trial by quoting portions of the trial transcript itself and through actual exhibits, rather than relying on the author's arguably biased recollection. It will take you inside the prosecutor's offices, where Marcia Clark, Chris Darden, Rod Harmon, Woody Clark, Brian Kelburg, Bill Hodgman, other team members, and I made key strategy decisions. There is a common theme in each chapter. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of guilt. Each issue the defense raised was convincingly shown to be spurious. Therefore, the answer to the question so many are asking, why was the verdict not guilty, cannot be found in the evidence, the jury instructions, or the courtroom tactics of the prosecution or defense. We must look to factors external to the courtroom itself to understand the verdict. Having shown that the explanation for the trial's outcome cannot be discovered within the four walls of the courtroom, the book will address in its conclusion some of the external factors that played a role in the case. The trial and its outcome have polarized the nation. The case raises larger issues about racism, sexism, the problem of domestic violence, the nature of celebrity status in our society, the proper role of community police departments, and the impact of media coverage on criminal trials. The Simpson trial is also likely to be an impetus for changes in our legal system. I hope that this book will allow interested members of the public to truly understand the entirety of the case. The Simpson trial focused attention on some of the most challenging problems of our time. Issues arose that the criminal justice system and criminal trials were not intended to handle, let alone resolve. While I believe the outcome represents a travesty of justice, it is my sincerest hope that out of this tragedy can come some good. For too long we have tried to deal with painful problems in our society by ignoring them. We hoped that if we didn't look at them, perhaps they would go away. Confronting the truth is the first step toward change. I hope this book will, at least in some small measure, contribute to discovering the truths inherent in this case.